Hello and welcome to this online event on democracy versus autocracy and the great power struggle. I'm Nate Sibley. I'm a research fellow at Hudson Institute and I'll be moderating the discussion today. This event is the third and final session of this year's Transatlantic Think Tank Conference, which is co-hosted by Hudson Institute here in Washington, DC, and the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies in Brussels. This is in fact the first ever public session in the conference's 11-year history. So a very warm welcome to all of our viewers and listeners online. Delighted also to be joined by a panel today of very distinguished experts who bring a broad range of experience and expertise to the discussion. First, we're going to hear from Roland Freudenstein. He's a policy director. He's been at the Martin Center, where he's been since 2008. He previously served on foreign and security planning staff of the European Commission in Brussels, various foundations and think tanks, as well as representing the city of Hamburg to the EU. Constanze Stelzenmüller, is the senior fellow for foreign policy in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, where she is also the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic relations. As you'd expect, with a job title like that, she is an expert on German, European, and transatlantic foreign security policy and strategy. Last but not least, my colleague Ken Weinstein. He is the Walter P. Stern Distinguished Fellow at Hudson Institute. He led Hudson Institute as our president and CEO from 2011 until last year when he was nominated by President Trump to be ambassador to Japan. So we're going to hear from each of our experts on this not a small topic at all in a series of opening remarks. Following which we'll have a discussion and a Q&A. This is very much open to the audience, so please send any questions you may have for us via the Facebook or YouTube chat, and they'll be conveyed to us by our colleagues at the Martin Center, and I'll be able to put them to the panelists for you. So firstly, I suppose just to set the scene, past decade, geopolitical tensions have increased markedly around the world. This is partly, of course, due to the rise and increased assertiveness of China on one hand, and also the continuing revisionism and frankly rogue actions of Russia on the other. Increasingly, this great power competition has been cast as one between fundamentally different political systems. The democratic West and its Asian partners are competing for power and influence with autocratic, kleptocratic even, as I would say, Russia and China, which hold different values and a different vision of how the international system should be organized. They sought to export their political systems and corrupting influence through such instruments as the Belt and Road Initiative and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So today we're going to discuss what Europe and the US can do to boost the resilience of their own political systems on a practical level, as well as those of their partners around the world. For example, do we need to form an alliance of democracies? And on a more fundamental level, what kind of, is democracy versus autocracy a helpful way to conceive of the great power competition? What kind of opportunities and limitations might arise for Europe and the US in conceiving of their grand strategy in this way? Or should we be looking at the world in quite a different way altogether? So with those questions in mind, I'm going to kick it over to our first speaker, Roland. Perhaps you'd like to give us a quick introduction.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks for having me in this debate. Originally, we were supposed to have an Estonian general and former general and member of the European Parliament. He couldn't make it, so I'm replacing him here. And I'd like to refer to the actually two questions that are in the title of this debate here. One is the democracy versus autocracy conflict or antagonism, and the other one is the great power showdown. And, the great power showdown could be anything. I mean, it could be between anyone. It could be between Athens and Sparta, if you want. Whereas democracy versus autocracy, and Nate, you already referred to that in your intro, is clearly based on values and on the respective political systems. And that makes all the difference. And, just to start with a little maybe provocation, I think the last US administration would have rather framed it as a great power showdown, where America needs to defend itself against a more assertive China because we are Americans and because they are Chinese, right? Whereas What this administration under Joe Biden is trying to get across and trying to convince its allies and friends in the world of is that this is indeed part of a global struggle. This is not a US-China rivalry, like we've had so many rivalries in history. This is not just the US and China, and it's not even just Europe plus the US and China, or Europe plus the US against China and Russia. No, this is really a struggle, a global struggle of two political systems, of two ways of conceiving politics. And that brings me to a couple of criticisms that are regularly made against this bipolar model of seeing the future of the world, and a couple of responses to these criticisms. So, we hear very often, and very often from my fellow Europeans, I must say, because we all know that this is a great US-European debate as much as it is a debate within Europe and a debate within the United States. So we hear from a lot of my fellow Europeans that, first of all, business can be and should be separated from politics, right? That you can, business is a bit like diplomacy. It's talking to people or doing business and deals with people you don't like. So the argument goes that, I mean, if we applied human rights standards in terms of our concept of human rights to every business partner in the world, we could forget about, well, maybe 50% of all deals that we make or more. The next argument it talks about the new Cold War, the danger of actually pushing China and Russia into the corner, maybe actually pushing them together, incentivizing them to cooperate instead of being more nuanced, seeing that a couple of our own friends are no angels, and seeing that maybe there is some capital to be gained, so to speak, politically, capital to be gained from trying to separate China and Russia, and that means being nicer to one of them once in a while. But at any price to avoid a Cold War, and even Chancellor Merkel has talked like this recently. The other argument is that, by framing the whole conflict as a global antagonism between democracy and autocracy, you will never take countries along like Pakistan or like Vietnam, countries that would be ready to cooperate with the West because they don't like China or because they have fears of Russia, but countries that reject this dualism, this binary way of looking at it, because they aren't democracies. So aren't we like pushing some potential friends away with framing the whole conflict like this? And then there is another argument which refers to a post-Biden US and the question whether Europe should now invest into a relationship which may actually be weakened, eroded, or even annihilated by a future administration in Washington, which may be closer to what we've had over the past 4 years. And let me just now respond to these points. First of all, the separation of business and politics doesn't work because it's not accepted by our partners, by our partners / antagonists in China, for example, in Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party does everything but separating business from politics. Economic deals, economic interaction, from trade to investment to technological cooperation, what have you, is all part of one big concept, and that is geared towards shaping the world in the image of the Chinese Communist Party. So as long as the other side doesn't recognize the separation, I don't think Europe can get away with this. Second, yes, of course, we have some ugly friends, maybe. Just today is the 20th of July. 20th of July 1944, some officers in the German Wehrmacht tried to kill Hitler and actually were planning a coup against Hitler in the last year of World War II, basically. Those guys were not liberal Democrats, but in that concrete situation, they were on the right side of history. Even knowing that they may fail, knowing that to try this is even more important than to succeed. So what I'm saying here is that it really depends. You know, to cooperate among democracies does not exclude cooperating in selected cases with authoritarians, as long as they do not try to undermine or even destroy our democracies and the cooperation of free countries. About the Cold War argument, the question, I mean, is it useful to divide the universe into black and white, good and evil, or what have you? I would say the alternative to the division of the world in basically two spheres is to enable China to divide and rule. Those Europeans who are saying we should, by all means, prevent a new Cold War are people who, whether they want it or not, are giving China the opportunity to precisely separate Europe from America, weaken and divide the member states of the European Union, and thereby win the game. So having said all this, and I'm going to conclude with that, I think there are 3 points that I think the European Union should follow in making China a central topic in transatlantic relations. I mean, first of all is, you know, ending this artificial separation between values and interests, because I think values are long-term interests. And that means that it is in our interest to be as strong as possible vis-a-vis authoritarian powers, and their cheerleader is China, as we've said before. So to push our interests, which are our values, we have, I think, no chance then to cooperate with other democracies. And the third point, we're not alone with the United States. You know, this may, to some people in Central Europe, this may even sound ominous. To a lot of people in Western Europe, I think this may sound like something to sweeten the pill, so to speak, because it doesn't mean that we're isolated with the United States. We have other democracies worldwide, and this concerns, of course, Canada, Australia, Japan, India, Taiwan, South Korea, and. So among these democracies, to engender a global alliance, which may entail you know, like a COCOM list, a technology export policy to authoritarian countries, the joint agreement on sanctions, coordination of sanctions, exchange of intelligence, cooperation within the United Nations and its sub-organizations, working on supply chains, reforming the World Trade Organization, and of course, most importantly, democracy support, civil societies cooperating with each other and supporting democrats in countries that are not democracies. So enough said from my side. Over to you, Nate.
Thanks. Well, I gave you a huge question, and you managed to really frame that very, very well and succinctly. So thank you for that, Ron. Constanza, perhaps you'd like to go next.
Good morning. Thank you, first off, for having me on with this great group of speakers. I think the problem that I see for all three of us is that we are likely to agree on many, many things. At least if I know my friend Roland and if I know Ken correctly, the likelihood of that is quite great. So I think what I'm going to do is perhaps raise a couple of warnings about being complacent about democracy at home. And since I live in America, but I'm a guest in this country, I will talk about my own country, Germany, where it has to be said that the AfD has not had a good pandemic. The AfD, the hard right party in Germany, which, if you look at its party platforms, thinks that the current constitutional order in Germany is illegitimate and needs to be replaced, is essentially has painted itself into a strategic corner from which I think it can't get out. Not only has it not really had any constructive ideas on how to deal with a pandemic or the European economic crisis, it has radicalized more and more throughout the past 12, 18 months. Some of you will have heard of Der Flügel, the hard right wing of the AfD, which was under threat of being put under observation by domestic intelligence and then dissolved itself preemptively. The truth is that the Flügel is now running the AfD. The folks who were the leaders of Der Flügel are now the key figures in the AfD. The other thing that they've done notably is disciplined what was previously a notoriously undisciplined party. That too has caught the attention, not just of the authorities, but of the German public. And you can see that in surveys. There is, I think, a great, I think it's legitimate to say, revulsion and a consensus at this revulsion at the positions that the AfD takes across the German party political spectrum. With some notable exceptions, I would say, in Die Linke, the hard left party, elements of which find themselves in distinct agreement with some of the ideological positions of the AfD, but which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. One other notable point is that most of the European hard right doesn't want to leave the European Union. Marine Le Pen doesn't want to leave the European Union. Viktor Orban doesn't want to leave the European Union. They want to fiddle around with it, but they don't want to leave it. They're keenly interested in receiving the financial benefits of membership. But the German AfD has now put this into its party platform, that they want to leave the European Union. Yet another way in which I think they're making themselves unelectable. But that should not be a reason to think that the AfD has become neutralized and has lost and has become a force in German politics that one can overlook. For one, it's still reliably polling at around 10%. And what that de facto means is that for the foreseeable future, it's become extremely unlikely that we have two-way coalitions at the national level, including in September's in the September election. That will make German politics more complicated and more difficult to negotiate and more inward-looking. The other thing that they're doing is trying to undermine the stability of politics at the regional and local level. They're currently trying to oust the minister president of Thuringia with a no confidence motion. They also continue to wage culture wars via lawsuits. They continue to undermine the state legislatures, using them as platforms for their debates without engaging in the actual legislative work. In other words, the AfD does an awful lot of damage in the day-to-day work of governance, trying to undermine the credibility, the effectiveness, and the legitimacy of representative democracy. And that bears watching. In other words, we have no reason whatsoever to be complacent about the state of German democracy just because the AfD itself has painted itself into a corner. And because all of the parties, and most importantly, of course, the CDU, have a non-cooperation order, The AfD won't be in a coalition with anybody anytime soon. But what that means is that there's really only one way to power for the AfD, which is tunneling into the adjacent party, which is the CDU. And there I will only point out that the Werteunion, which is a relatively small, informal, non-recognized grouping on the right wing of the party, of the CDU, has elected a new leader in the form of Max Otte, who has been very open about his sympathies for the AfD. Somewhat to my relief, this has meant that this has led to a lot of resignations among Werteunion members in other regions. But there is one member who is very much not resigning and who is still very active, and that is the former head of the German Domestic Intelligence Service, Hans-Georg Maaßen, who is running for a direct mandate in Thuringia, and who I think has made it his mission to challenge the CDU leader, Armin Laschet, every other day on one thing or another, and who interestingly also seems to have an American strategy, publishing pieces in American magazines. He had one in a Stanford magazine called Telos a couple months ago that, once it was translated into German, created a bit of a scandal. Why am I going on at such length about this? I think that we can talk about the conditions under which we should trade with China, the conditions under which we should have pipeline deals with Russia. We can criticize Hungary. We can criticize Poland's treatment of its constitutional judges. But if we don't manage to deal with the threats to our democracy at home credibly, effectively, mount a determined defense of our own representative democracies against these things, then I don't see how in the long term we have any legitimacy to do all these other things. That is my biggest concern. I'm a constitutional lawyer by training. I think once you see people in your own system attacking the institutions, the values, and the principles of representative democracy, and you are not seen to mount a determined resistance against that, and I'm very grateful to Roland for mentioning that today is July 20th, the day that Stauffenberg and others tried to oust Hitler, and of course failed, leading to the outcome that we all know. If you don't defend your democracy when you still can, there will come a point when you no longer can. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constanze. Definitely a few things to think about there. As you said, I think most people on this panel probably align more or less on most of the big issues. So it's great to hear a word of warning from you before we proceed. But Ken, you're next up. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Nate. Thank you for having me. Delighted to be back with my old friends at the Martin Center, and Roland in particular. Delighted to be with my fellow Stern chair from Constanze as well. And as I think about this question, I look at it more from a foreign policy perspective, though I agree we need to be very vigilant about the state of democracies at home. And there were deep concerns, I think, on both the left and the right that we need to take seriously about in our political cultures that we really do need to be vigilant about. But I'm going to focus more on the questions that Roland raised, and begin by saying, of course, the division of democracies and autocracies is real. It's got theoretical importance. It's obviously of practical importance. The autocracies of the world, as Nate mentioned, have absolutely been on the march for some time now, exploiting our weaknesses, taking advantage of free societies, whether it be cyber hacking, whether it be taking advantage of our economic systems through kleptocracies to hide their assets abroad, taking advantage of the lack of democratic deliberation needed on foreign policy decisions to act both tactically and strategically in ways that our foreign policy people would never imagine. And it's a serious challenge. And the appeal of the autocratic model, the autocratic operating system is especially deep because it tells leaders not only will you have control over your government, but you'll have control over your own people. And we've seen this with China's attempt to export its spyware, its telephone systems, its facial recognition systems to get fellow autocracies into its operating system so that these leaders get control and know what their people are doing. So in that sense, it's absolutely critical that we in the West do all that we can to try to deleverage autocracies, whether it be making sure that there's open internet access where possible. And I applaud the efforts to try to get more internet access into Cuba right now at this time of what seems like a potential revolution. The work of our surrogate radio broadcasters, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Deutsche Welle, etc., that bring credible news to people under autocracies who are starved of news. Obviously, the important work that Nate has done in fighting kleptocracies and not allowing autocrats to hide their assets in the West and benefit they and their families from the money they've stolen from their people. But that being said, I agree with what Roland said about the division between autocracy and kleptocracy, that drawing too hard a line, too rigid a line, it sounds good rhetorically. I think it is much more relevant in Europe, the autocracy democracy distinction in some ways for the great power competition that we're in than it actually perhaps may be in Asia. It may be necessary to rally our European allies in some sense to these efforts, but that we also have to be focused on the key strategic challenge of our time, which remains China, and that our key allies in the battle against China, particularly in Asia, are all democracies: Japan, Australia, Taiwan, India. We need to work with them to strengthen democratic norms and principles, but we can't preclude cooperating, and this is necessary in the free and open Indo-Pacific. It's one of the paradoxes of that strategy that we absolutely need the cooperation of Vietnam. The U.S. just recently did a base visit to Haiphong Harbor. It's a critical partner for us. We need the cooperation of Thailand. We need the cooperation, which is our longest standing treaty ally in Asia. From this perspective, the Philippines, particularly in a scenario involving Taiwan and China. So to me, the question is the autocracy democracy distinction, which is important, but putting it at the center of foreign policy rhetorically, which is necessary in some sense to awaken Americans from our tendencies towards isolationism, towards disengagement. How central ought it to be? And I think that by putting too central a focus on it, we really do risk sending potential partners towards China, towards the autocratic operating system that China is trying to export, and that in the great power competition, particularly in Asia, that it won't help us. And in the end, I think we really need some balance and some flexibility. Unfortunately, the world of foreign and defense policy is not a world of idealism, as we've learned the hard way in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that we can't downplay our security interests. We need greater flexibility in dealing with these with the real challenge, which is China as of now. And so I think we need to sort of step back and focus on autocracy. Absolutely, make the distinction. It's important, but to put it at the center of our foreign policy, I think, is a mistake. And I'll leave it at that for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I'm already sensing some sort of divergence in some of the approaches we're taking, which is great. But just quickly, I think, Roland, you said you wanted to. I think the majority of this discussion is going to be foreign policy focused, as you focused on, Ken. But just because Constanza brought up some really interesting issues about whether we the legitimacy of our approach in terms of domestic threats to democracy before we even start worrying about autocracies. Roland, I think you wanted to respond quickly, and I've also got a question already, Constanza, for you from the audience. But Roland, if you wanted to.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. In fact, two very, very brief responses to both my colleagues. So starting with Constanze, yet of course we shouldn't be complacent. Of course we have problems of our own in Germany, in the European Union with Viktor Orban or Kaczynski in Poland. But you know, and now I'm really in danger of sounding whataboutist. But if we look at the threat from identitarian, sovereignist, nationalist forces, I want to also call our attention to something that comes from a different political side, which is not the same degree of danger for our democracies, but it has made life easier for the Viktor Orbáns or the AfDs of this world and the Donald Trumps. And that is woke aggression or progressive, radical progressiveness, and the limitation or the impression that free speech is being limited in certain environments in our societies through a concept of liberalism which doesn't permit any fundamental disagreement as even legitimate to be discussed. I would like to stick to this point that has at least made the life of our nationalists and the people and the forces that undermine our democracies from within much easier. And it needs to be discussed. I sometimes have the impression that, at least on the intellectual level, the political left discusses this more openly and more actively than moderate conservatives. But it needs to be addressed. And just a brief response to Ken, you know, ultimately, how central do we make the autocracy democracy divide? If we make it too central, as you said, we may push away countries that would otherwise cooperate with us. But if we put it too low on the priority list, I don't think there is any chance you get even the majority of the member states of the European Union into some kind of strategic cooperation and coordination of policy, especially vis-a-vis China, if you do not put it under the label of democracy versus autocracy, because then it is just, I mean, are you willing to follow the American superpower or not? And we all know how this, in the meantime, resonates with European electorates. I would say 2/3 of the member states of the European Union, public opinion will not go for this. So, you know, to frame this, the future a decisive global struggle as one between autocracy and democracy, I think is our only chance to save transatlantic relations. I'm putting it that bluntly.
That's great. Constanze, I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of that, but we've also got a question based on your remarks. How and should the US and Europe work more closely together to deal with the increasing influence of media spreading sort of misinformation, particularly online, obviously, and you know, because that is where people get informed. It's where they pick up these ideas. It's where they pick up these opinions. It's a very broad question again, but what role do you see for the US and Europe learning from each other and working together to bring some kind of balance to a sort of media landscape that often seems to have spun somewhat out of control?
Thank you. Roland, I think you and I are not going to agree on the question of the relationship between sort of left-wing wokeness, if you will, the left wing's culture wars and the right. I think that in Germany that is genuinely a false equivalence, and only one of those groups you know, creates zones in which people who don't look like us are beaten up with baseball bats. Yeah. And there's a difference. And I think to suggest there is an equivalence, I think undercuts the dangerousness and the malignancy of intent of the hard right. I'm sorry, so I just can't go there. And I dislike the sort of left-wing authoritarianism, and have disliked it since my childhood. You and I both probably had 68 teachers who were not particularly pleasant, but it's just not the same thing. On how America and Europe could work together. The problem here, Nate, is that we do have quite, and I say this as a trained lawyer, we do have quite different historical and legal conceptions of freedom of speech. And that for Germans, it is far easier, far more natural to frame certain sort of prohibitions on hate speech than it is in America. And again, I am liberal enough to have always liked, to have always preferred the American approach to a maximum of freedom in the agora. But I also see the damage that approach has wrought, in combination with it seems to me, an explicit privileging well, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Supreme Court jurisprudence, Citizens United, privileging corporate speech as free speech. I think that we probably both have experiences to share. It seems to me that the American free speech market is underregulated, and ours may be overregulated. And perhaps we can have an exchange of it might be worthwhile having best practices exchanges on these things. I think the thing to understand is that usually hard right movements in Europe or elsewhere in the world tend to be quite parochial. So they actually find it hard to cooperate with each other, or the Steve Bannons of this world or the Yoram Hazonis of this world find it harder to organize them into, as it were, a right-wing ummah, find that more difficult than they thought it would be. Arguably, both Bannon and Hazoni have failed with those efforts, to my relief, I will say. But I think the degree to which hate speech is left unchecked and on social media platforms, from which the owners of those social media platforms profit immensely, and the degree of damage that is wrought by that lack of regulation, I think is worth examining. In other words, yes, I do, as a European, come down firmly on the side of greater regulation of social media platforms for hate speech. And I don't know whether we can find a transatlantic agreement on that, but seeing the damage that's been done, I think it would be worthwhile discussing it. Sorry, that's the best I could do.
No, that's okay. We're dealing with some big. I'm so grateful to have such a talented group of people who can distill such big questions into such concise answers. I'm going to use my sort of privilege as a moderator to ask a question now. We've got questions coming in, which is great, but we've only got sort of 20 minutes left. So I wanted to sort of root this in not that we've not been talking about the real world, but upcoming events. One of which is this much touted Summit for Democracy that President Biden committed to during his campaign, and has half the White House staff scurrying around trying to figure out now who to invite and what is a democracy and so on and so forth. I wonder if anyone wants to sort of take up that question. Well, particularly, do we need this Summit for Democracy? Do we need this moment where democracies come together with the leader of the free world sort of rejuvenated from the Trump era in people's eyes, and we're all going to get on happy families at this conference? all our regulatory, everything's going to be aligned, and do we need this, or is the process of democracies coming together to face the autocratic threat, should that be allowed to happen in a more organic way?
Can I just very quickly, we had several summits on democracy in early June, between the G7 meeting, and leading up to, but very much not including the meeting in Geneva. Those were democracy summits, all of them. And I think for all the reasons that you've just stated, and a summit of democracies about democracy itself is less than useful. And I think that the administration has gotten a lot of advice in writing very early on from all the think tanks in Washington to not do this, and not from people who thought that democracy was a bad thing, but it's a bad idea to push it into the foreground in this way. But maybe Roland or Ken want to disagree with me.
Roland, you put your hand up pretty sharpish after that question. So
yeah, look, I see the danger that this it fizzles out. I think the main danger is that it fizzles out like Madeleine Albright's project of a global alliance. I don't know what the wording was, but there was an attempt to do something like this around 2000, and it completely fizzled out in a short time. I don't think it's gonna disappear so quickly now, simply because the authoritarian onslaught against democracy is so much more pertinent at the moment. But I would actually tend to agree with Constanze in saying, let's use existing formats, and let's use a mix of formats. We have the G7, we have the Quad in Asia, we have the Five Eyes of US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We might think of something called the D10, like 10 strong, medium-sized or large democracies, and within these formats, we need to tackle those things that I mentioned in the very beginning. Intelligence exchange, talking about securing supply chains, reforming the WTO, the UN system, coordinating sanctions, and above all, supporting civil society across the world. So I mean, those tasks, and this would also be what I would like to have on the agenda of one global democracy summit. But I see the pitfalls, I see the risks connected to this. If then it leads to frustration because the big effort is not bearing fruit immediately. So I would rather work with several formats in parallel, but the tasks are clearly there, and there is a massive need for coordination among the world's democracies. So I mean, that's what we should focus on, the tasks, and not so necessarily on the organization.
Ken, did you have any thoughts on the prospects for the Summit for Democracy?
No, I'm of agreement. I remember, was it the Council of Democracies that was launched during the Bush era, and there were one or two meetings and it kind of went nowhere. And I think that over meetings, not useful. What we really do need to do is focus on the strategic tasks that we face together as democracies, to come together, as Roland mentioned, on cooperation, in all the areas that we need to remain unified on. And that's something that that's more critical than any particular format or any particular forum would be.
Just had an interesting question come in from the YouTube chat. And it could stray into sort of unpleasant territory, but I'll reframe it a bit. It's about demographic changes in the world. I read an article, I think it was a few weeks ago, which said that Nigeria potentially will have a bigger population than China by some date that was a lot earlier. I can't remember exactly. And so as we think about the future of democracy and democracies, every democracy is undergoing huge demographic change at the moment. In the US, white people are scheduled to be less than half a population whenever it is, pretty soon, I think. And so, you know, how do we respond to these sorts of challenges? That's a question from we don't have a name, but online. I don't know if anyone wants to take that one. It's sort of an unusual one.
Don't you think we should only respond to questions that where people sign their real names? Honestly,
Yeah,
seriously, I find that a bit of an issue. I think people shouldn't sort of ask questions anonymously.
Oh, okay, I've got it. It's Michael Ben Hamu.
Okay.
I've got it.
No, yeah, I think it's a serious question. Particularly the Africa demographic question is a real issue as we see European populations starting to decrease, at least in terms of birth rates, as we see the same in among Asian democracies, and we see the real rise of sub-Saharan Africa demographically going into mid-century. That this actually poses a real challenge for us as we think through this issue of democracy, autocracy, given, frankly, the lack of broadly and deeply embedded democratic institutions in Africa, and and the fact that we see significant Chinese engagement, for better or for worse. It hasn't always been positive with elites in Africa, and so I think it's another area where the sort of stark contrast between democracy and autocracy may not be of assistance to us, as we need to work closely with Africans in this period of geostrategic competition. We also need to help them build up their democratic institutions.
Roland, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, look, if the demographic development of Africa becomes a problem for Africa and then for Europe, that is not because of the number of Africans, that is because of the governance, the ability of countries and governments to create livable conditions in their countries. And you know, it's not the question of how many Africans do we have and how many Europeans. The question is, you know, can people actually make a living, quite literally, where they are now, or otherwise do they feel compelled to migrate? And here we just haven't found the answer yet. You know, we're groping for ways of incentivizing good governance in African countries. And, you know, in the short run, people may feel attracted to the local strongmen who keep their borders closed to emigration. And that is a very, very short-sighted view of European-African relations, to just pay the strongman to keep his people in, right? That's not going to work. You know, latest by the moment the strongman dies or is replaced by someone else, you have a moment of instability and the whole system may collapse. So, in other words, but how to incentivize and promote good governance, which always goes along with fundamental rights and checks and balances. We have not found the magic formula yet. We have to be open about it, and this is something that we need to address also in transatlantic relations and with other democracies around the world.
Constance, you had your finger up there.
Well, let me perhaps remind everyone that the pandemic is now ravaging parts of the world that have particularly bad governance, and that the likelihood of historic death tolls is now firmly correlated with a lack of decent governance. And we haven't seen the end of it yet, right? I mean, one of the tragedies of this pandemic is that it reveals the extraordinary divergences in quality of governance between democracies and non-democracies, but also within democracies. I think the one thing that we've learned from the pandemic is that democracies are also really, really bad at catastrophic prevention. We've also just seen that in the floods in Germany. And so right now, I think we have to assume that the pandemic is going to have a massive impact on the field of demographics as we know it, and that we are not in a position at this point to know what the damage will be. But I think we can expect it to be catastrophic. One of the things that we haven't mentioned today yet, but which Roland's mention of governance gets to, is the question of the role of the state in democracies, and the state as a provider of public goods. And it seems to me that both the floods and the pandemic have shown us that there is a crucial role, an essential role for state institutions, because typically this kind of disaster, neither disaster prevention nor disaster relief can be shouldered by the markets or by civil society. And I think we're seeing a reevaluation of the role of the state as a provider of public goods in a variety of debates, which I think is overdue. But one of the, again, and this brings me back to my earlier point of complacency, I think that the pandemic has also taught us that we in our Western democracies have been unduly complacent about the effectiveness, the working of our democracy in situations such as this. And we have learned the opposite at great cost.
Thanks. And just we're sort of coming towards the end of our time now. So I've got a question which I'm going to paraphrase from Tom MacDonald, which you knew was coming at some point. But what are some of the ways in which the EU and the US can be more coordinated in their relationship with other states, particularly in terms of with China? The recent lack of coordination, so we say, on the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on investment, for example, exposed a pretty big rift in some respects. So, any thoughts you have on the China relationship? Just it might have time for another question, but perhaps this might be the last one. We'll see how we go. Roland?
Yeah, I think the Trade and Technology Council that was agreed, I think already a couple of months ago between the US and the European Union is a good step. I mean, the fact is that Europe's relevance to this, and especially to future US administrations, is very strongly determined, not alone, but very strongly co-determined by how much of an ally Europe can be vis-a-vis China. And then again, it's not us talking, it's certainly not the Biden administration talking about a Cold War. That's been a terminology used by first the Chinese Communist Party and then some European leaders. But I think we're on a good way to, first of all, coordinating on some nitty-gritty details, not only in terms of intelligence exchange, common efforts and experience of exchange of best practice on fighting disinformation, but also trade. And this is what I found so unfortunate in the clear refusal of the European Union to even communicate strategically, wait a few weeks and communicate strategically before they signed the investment agreement with China, and communicate before that with the new administration, despite their very kind demand to do so. So I think the jury is still out whether this is going to work. I think Europe, in Europe, you have a huge spectrum of opinions. What to coordinate it with the US, how to do it, to what extent we can use our a China policy as a bargaining chip and demand this or ask this from the United States in turn for us being useful in China terms. Well, I don't buy this this view. I would say that you know, looking at the history of the last decades, actually, I mean, Europe has to use the momentum of the Biden administration and has to put something on the table in terms of being useful vis-a-vis China. So I think I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic, but I think there are some very, very encouraging signs, and yet we are not there yet in a productive formulation of a common strategy towards China that covers all aspects from security to business. That's it.
Ken, I'll come to you in a minute, Constance, but Ken, I think you had your finger up first a while back, right?
Yeah, just briefly, because we're running out of time. But a key problem that the Europeans face is one of institutions and the need for unanimity on critical issues at the national level. And until this issue is resolved, China autocracies will continue to take advantage of our democratic systems to cause problems. And so this is, I think there's a need for some kind of an institutional fix before the cooperation can really get to the level that it needs to, though I agree with everything Roland's said.
I think this will probably be last word to you, Constanza.
Very briefly, you know, a lot of the key issues in Europe are dealt with on the intergovernmental level. Yeah, I mean, the JCPOA was negotiated intergovernmentally and not by the EU Commission. And it seems to me that something as crucial as the relationship with China is unlikely to be handled by the EU Commission anytime soon, or by Ursula von der Leyen. It will be the big governments with the other ones trailing behind or using the big ones as cover. So I don't think that's the problem. It also seems to me that Merkel's balancing of Germany's rootedness in the West and its Ostpolitik and extreme Ostpolitik, now including China, is increasingly an outlier, at least among the sort of policy makers and the legislature in Berlin. What bothers me more is the candidates for her succession, at least the conservative one and the social democrat one, using expressions that suggest that either they're building up straw men, and by that I mean talking about a new Cold War or about Americans wanting us to decouple, or that they aren't sufficiently read into these debates. I actually think that there is a great deal of overlap in the assessment of the strategic risk that is entailed in relations with China, and I think this week's joint US-EU declarations and NATO declarations on Chinese cyber attacks, I think shows that we're already getting to a point not just of a shared assessment, but shared reactions. Remember that when Lukashenko hijacked that European plane, and the Europeans immediately slammed Belarus with sanctions, the White House was startled and took a while to make up its mind. That was bad because it seemed as though there were a distance between us in the assessment of the situation. This strikes me as an example of all of us learning that we either need to speak on this together, or we will continue to be divided. And so I'm actually quite encouraged by this development.
It is nice to end on an optimistic note, because we have come to the end of our time now. So it forced me to thank you all so much for your time and your insights today. I don't think I've ever been in a think tank panel where we've dealt with so many big ideas and such wide-ranging issues, and you've all been more than capable of the task of distilling those into some really interesting ideas. So thank you to you. Thank you also from Hudson Institute to our partners at the Martin Center, who did much of the heavy lifting for organizing the conference this year. And I suppose it just forced me to say, very pleased to include the public in our final session for the first time ever, and I hope we're able to do that again next year, and we'll see you then.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you all. Stay well.
Okay.